In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Today we have the feast of Saint Peter Celestine, who was a monk, a hermit for 80 years, roughly, and pope for 5 months. So he was born to humble parents in the year 1215 in Sicily, and he was one of 11 boys. So a rather busy family. And his father died when he was young, and his mother was left raising all those boys. And of all the boys, she noticed he in particular had a kind of an unusual piety, and so she saw to it that he was educated and learned to read and so on. And he joined a Benedictine monastery at age 17, but by the time he was 24, he found the Benedictine monastery was just too easy, not penitential enough, not difficult enough. So he went off and he found a cave in a mountain and lived there for a few years. And he was doing very difficult austerities, staying up at night, doing fastings, watchings, and sure enough, his piety attracted other holy souls. And so some people came to him for advice, and in fact 2 others came and wanted to join his hermitage. So he took on, we could say, two others, hermits with him, but eventually, that place just became too busy. He was like getting, a visitor every week or something like that. It's too busy here. So he left. He went to go to a place even further remote to increase his austerities, and it just didn't work. Eventually, I don't know, maybe his old abbot ordered him to become a priest under obedience. So Peter Celestine went and was ordained a priest out of obedience, even though he didn't think he was worthy, but out of that humility and yielding his will to somebody else's will, he accepted and became a priest. And we'll see that same spirit of docility eventually led to him becoming pope. But as a priest, he suffered from scruples. And this is the danger of holy souls, is that they won't consent to any direct sins. They don't have any really direct faults, but they will fall prey to thinking so much about sin and wanting so much to be perfect that they actually make an error on the other side. And so for months and months, he would not say Mass because he felt tempted. He was getting these temptations from the devil, and they were very troubling to him. And the advice of other holy persons was, don't worry about the temptations. If you don't consent, they're not sins. But Peter Celestine could not overcome his scruples. So he undertook a journey to Rome to seek counsel from the Pope. And en route was one of his deceased abbots, appeared to him in a vision and said, don't worry about it. These are just scruples. Now get back to your cave and start saying Mass every day. And so Peter Celestine, again, that docility of spirit, he went back and overcame his scruples. And that is what, in the early ages, the 13th century, they didn't have all the theology and all of the developed doctrine that we have now, but we can see they struggled from the same things, right? And maybe, I don't know if they called it scruples back then, but that was what he was suffering from, and that's strangely enough, that's a subtle kind of pride, his scruples are. Is that I don't want to sin so much, I'm so afraid of being imperfect, I'm so afraid of feeling like I've offended God, that we end up failing to do good, right? And that's the Satan's trick. If he can't get us to do evil, he'll prevent us from doing good, and that's what scruples do. For 4 months, a saint did not say Mass. All those Masses that could have been pleasing to God, he wasn't saying them because he was afraid, right? He didn't want to feel like he was doing something wrong. There's more to it than that, but that's an angle we have to look at it as. When you get the advice of other people, other holy, good, virtuous people, that's not a sin. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. We operate on facts, not on feelings. And by the way, that is the classic hallmark of scruples. What did you do? Did you consent? What did you do wrong? Are you sure? I don't know. Oh, I'm not sure. Classic sign. You're not sure. Peter Celestine went back, was saying Mass, overcame his scruples, spent long nights in prayer. He wore a hair shirt with knots in it, and he kept Lent 4 times throughout the year. He kept 4 Lents, and he would eat bread and water only during those times. And on Fridays, he wouldn't eat anything at all. He slept on a board, and he used a stone for his pillow. Maybe a little lesson for us. And during the day, he would occupy himself in manual labor or in copying books, and very often he was giving advice to more and more people who sought him out. Eventually, he would end up founding an order which came to be known as the Celestines, and this would have 36 monasteries and 600 monks and nuns. So that's kind of like eventually he gave up. He gave up in trying to get away from people and moving further and further away because so many came to him. He said, fine, I'll found an order. So he started that, and here he was, very docile, very much just wanted to be obedient and be left alone in solitude. And people came to him and sought him out, and he ended up founding an order of the church, and it's still active today. And this is the sign of God's providence. Is it when people start out with ambition and they start out with these admittedly good desires. I want to found an order in the church, and I want to accomplish these great things. But God can accomplish great things even despite us. Despite what we want to do, he may ask us to do that. And so St. Peter Celestine is an example of that. 600 monks and nuns under his order. He eventually, after founding it and getting permission from the Pope and establishing it, writing the Constitution, which he founded on the Benedictine rule, he handed it over to one of his other monks. He was not a very good leader or capable administrator, and he knew that. And so he handed that over, and it was very, very humble in that regards. So by the time Peter Celestine is about 80 years old, we're in the year 1294, something like that, and Rome had been sede vacante for 2 years. The previous pope had died, and the cardinals could not agree on which pope to elect. There was infighting, there was intrigue, and I've said this before, but the mafia comes from somewhere. The Italian mafia, right, the Godfather, this didn't come out of like New York or Chicago. That came from Italy, and it goes all the way back to the intrigues around the papacy. That's where the mafia comes from. The Orsini, what was the other one? The Romeo and Juliet families. That's like historical reality. They were fighting, and they were this arguing. So these factions couldn't agree. And Peter Celestine knows this, and he sends them an excoriating letter saying that God's wrath will come upon you if you don't lay aside your intrigues and your petty worldly desires and elect a pope, elect a father for the church. And perhaps reminiscent of the cry of the young boy to elect Ambrose for bishop, one of the cardinals says, "In the name of God, the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost, Peter for pope." And the others took up the cry, and they elected Peter Celestine without his knowledge as the next pope. And he finds this out. Like, they come and tell him that your letter had a great effect. He's like, oh, thanks be to God, and you were elected pope. So he runs away. He flees, and he takes a monk with him, and they try to escape. And he's not a very good fugitive from justice, because he was captured very quickly. And he asks this monk, "Will you please accompany me to the papacy?" And the monk says, "I am willing to follow you into your crown of thorns, but not into your exaltation. So you're on your own." So poor Peter Celestine went to Rome, went to the Basilica wasn't built yet, but he went to the church in Rome, and surrounded by kings and princes and bishops and luxury and wealth, and he's crowned pope. And this is when he takes the name Celestine. He was born Angelario, fitting name after the angels. That was his family name. But he took the name Celestine as Pope, Celestine V, because it means heaven, right? So the celestial realms, that's where he was always thinking, and that's where he wanted to be. And he just was not a good, I won't say he wasn't a good Pope, but he was not good at the duties the papacy required. He did not understand the intrigues. He was very easily duped. He didn't understand the duplicity, the mendacity of the various cardinals. He was taken advantage of. And it finally happened in Advent. He he gave over control of the papacy temporarily. He's like, look, I have to be able to go into solitude for Advent. I can't come to Christmas without having done proper preparation. And he left the papacy for about 4 weeks during Advent. And at the end of it, he found out that all kinds of awful decisions had been made. Just the intrigues had not ceased. They'd only gotten worse. And that was when he decided he was going to resign. And this was, again, in the year 1290, would have been 1294, the same year he was elected. He was elected in July, and he resigned in December. And so this would be something that did not occur again, as we know, until Pope Benedict resigned. And then you trace it all the way back to Peter Celestine. And so you think, why is it that this very holy man, this eminent sanctity, eminent penance, and fasting and all this, why would God raise him to the papacy and then only for him to resign and hand it over to somebody else, right? Why would the reward of a life of penance and prayer and hardship end in, we could say, failure, apparently? And it wasn't like after he resigned, he wanted to go back to his cave and just live up his life of a hermit. He was imprisoned by the succeeding pope, who didn't want him to be kidnapped and used as a political pawn, set up as an anti-pope, and so on. And so Peter Celestine, if you notice, a lot of the hermits, they'll live to be 80 or 100 years old, 120 even, living this austere life. Peter Celestine died 2 years later, and it was more out of grief than any sickness of the body. So a very difficult, very hard ending for St. Peter. And we would have to ask, again, why would God do something like that? Why would God allow this kind of failure for such a holy man? Well, again, we just have to look no further than the example of Christ himself. But also, we just don't know the designs of Providence. It could very well have been that, again, that conclave was stalled for 2 years. And St. Peter was the one that broke it out of that. Yes, he was elected, and he resigned only 5 months later, but very quickly another pope was elected. So it could have been he was just needed to break that stalemate and to get the Cardinals to act. That could have been in God's providence. Also, who knows what he did by his incredible example of humility and piety. Maybe he changed the hearts of some of those worldly men there in the Vatican and softened their hearts to be able to choose another pope and to get them to change their ways. We just don't know what the designs of Providence have in mind. That's why, as far as the heavens are above the earth, so are my thoughts above your thoughts, thus saith the Lord. And that's from the Old Testament prophets. So sometimes God does ask these very hard things from us, and whatever he asks, we have to be willing to give. We saw how docile, how humble St. Peter was. He accepted to be ordained a priest. He accepted that he had scruples and he should say Mass. He accepted to found a new order for these men and women coming to him. He resigned and gave the order over to somebody else. He accepted the papacy, then he resigned and gave that to somebody else. His whole life was very consistent in terms of that humility and that obedience. So that should be our lesson, in that God's will can be very strange sometimes and even seemingly opposite, but our job is, or our goal is not to be either too ambitious or too scrupulous, but to accept even difficult things if they're asked, but to look at ourselves and realize perhaps I'm not suited for this task which I've undertaken or which has been given to me, and we have to have the humility and the courage to be able to give that up if we have to. And that's what humility does. Humility recognizes the truth wherever it is, about others, about myself. Is it good? Is it bad? Am I good at something? Accept it. Am I not good at something? Accept that as well. That's true humility. So we can ask for St. Peter Celestine's intercession and help and prayers in these times when it seems that the world is just overcome with ambition and greed on all sides. Let's us be that example of humility and meekness to others. God bless you all. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost.